Did you know the 1960s gave us both the best and absolute worst westerns ever filmed? The decade that delivered masterpieces like The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly also cursed us with duds so bad, actors literally walked off set. While Clint Eastwood was redefining the genre, these forgotten flops were busy killing careers and emptying theaters. Which disaster wasted the most star power, and which famous director actually apologized to his cast after seeing the final cut? Let's saddle up and ride through Hollywood's dustiest, most embarrassing failures. 1. Gila in Pink Tights, 1960. Director George Cukor somehow convinced Sophia Loren and Anthony Quinn to don cowboy hats in this disaster about a traveling theater company running from creditors in the Wild West. Audiences couldn't stomach Loren's wooden performance and a plot thinner than saloon whiskey. Critics called it a western for people who hate westerns, and the box office numbers proved them right, with the film losing over $1.2 million in 1960 dollars. Behind the scenes, Cukor and Quinn feuded constantly. The director originally wanted Roger Moore for the lead, but the studio didn't consider him a big enough star and forced Quinn on him instead. Even more telling, Cukor desperately tried to cast either Jack Lemmon or James Garner, but was overruled by penny-pinching executives who had Quinn under contract. The script went through 14 rewrites, with the final version completed just 3 days before filming began. The film's marketing promised the authentic recapturing of the world of footlights, but delivered a mess where gunslingers randomly appeared and disappeared without logic. The costume designer reportedly quit halfway through production, explaining why Lauren's outfits changed styles so drastically between scenes. One particularly painful musical number was cut after preview. Audiences actually laughed during what was supposed to be a dramatic moment. Loren later admitted she took the role purely for the paycheck, saying, "Sometimes in Hollywood you must say yes to the worst to get offered the best." She confessed to spending most of her time on set studying English rather than her lines, which explains her disconnected performance. Quinn was no better, later describing the film as a fancy dress party where nobody knew what the theme was. Audiences and critics agreed on one thing: these non-Western actors utterly failed to bring this Western home, and the film became known as Cukor's Folly in industry circles. 2. A Thunder of Drums, 1961. Up-and-comers George Hamilton, Richard Chamberlain, and Dwayne Eddy couldn't save this dull tale of a veteran captain and young lieutenant facing renegade Apaches. The film hemorrhaged money, losing $42,000 at the box office, a substantial sum for 1961, cursed with a formulaic plot and action sequences so boring viewers checked their watches. Thunder barely registered a drizzle with audiences. Writer James Warner Bella was known for successful westerns, making this flop even more puzzling. Hollywood insiders were bewildered that such a solid cast produced such a box office catastrophe. The studio hastily cut several key scenes, leaving bizarre plot holes that confused viewers. Director Joseph Newman reportedly complained, "They turned my epic into a campfire sketch." The production was plagued with problems from the start. The original director quit after 2 days, claiming the script was unfixable. Location shooting in Arizona was repeatedly delayed by unseasonable rain, forcing many scenes to be shot on sound stages with unconvincing painted backdrops. During one battle scene, attentive viewers can spot cars driving on a highway in the distance because the remote location was actually just outside Phoenix. Richard Chamberlain later called it his Western career killer, noting he avoided the genre for years afterward. Hamilton was equally unimpressed, reportedly asking his agent, "Is this what my career has come to already?" During filming, one particularly embarrassing scene features an Apache attack where the same 6 stuntmen can be seen dying multiple times in different costumes. Critics labeled it a textbook example of how not to build tension in a frontier drama. The film promised emotions that explode, but delivered performances so flat they barely registered a whisper. Today, it's remembered as the film that nearly derailed 3 promising careers before they truly began. 3. The Last Sunset, 1961. Director Robert Aldrich wasted Rock Hudson and Kirk Douglas in this ponderous tale of a fugitive and sheriff driving cattle while fighting over Dorothy Malone. The film drowned in melodrama, with critics complaining that the Western elements seemed tacked onto a soap opera script rejected by daytime television. Audiences walked out confused about whether they'd watched a love story or a horse opera. The production was plagued with script problems, with Hudson and Douglas reportedly rewriting their lines each morning. Douglas later admitted, "We were making it up as we went along." Not the best approach for coherent storytelling. The love triangle subplot consumed so much screen time that the actual Western elements felt like an afterthought. Filming in Mexico created additional headaches. The cattle used for the drive sequences were so malnourished that they had to be painted to look healthier. Local extras hired for background roles frequently disappeared to their regular jobs, creating continuity nightmares for editors. One scene had to be completely reshot when it was discovered that a crew member had accidentally used the camera as a tripod for his lunch. Hudson and Malone reportedly couldn't stand each other off camera, creating palpable tension that worked for some scenes but made romantic moments excruciating to watch. Douglas tried to mediate their feuds but eventually gave up, telling Aldrich, "I'm an actor, not a marriage counselor." The cattle drive Sequences were so poorly filmed that most shots show fewer than 20 cows, despite dialogue referring to thousands of head. Critics were merciless, with one famously writing, "I've seen more exciting cattle drives in milk commercials." Another noted, "The Last Sunset is aptly named, as watching it feels like the slowest sunset in recorded history." The film's tagline promised sweeping adventure and wild excitement, but delivered conversations so lengthy cowboys in the audience fell asleep in their seats. Even the final shootout was described as two tired men who'd rather be napping than drawing guns. Despite star power, the film vanished quickly from theaters, proving that even Hollywood legends couldn't salvage a script this muddled. 4. The Canadians, 1961. This Canadian mounted police western tries pathetically to replicate the American formula, but ends up feeling like a weak impersonation. Director Burt Kennedy, normally reliable with westerns, delivered what critics called the most forgettable red coat adventure ever filmed. The Mounties might always get their man, but this film couldn't capture an audience if it tried. The production suffered from budget cuts that forced filming in Alberta during freak cold snaps, leaving actors visibly shivering in scenes meant to depict summer. Lead actor Robert Ryan later quipped, "The only thing authentic about this Canadian Western was how miserably cold we all were." The Sioux conflicts depicted were historically inaccurate, prompting formal complaints from both Native American groups and Canadian historical societies. The script underwent hasty rewrites when Canadian officials objected to scenes they felt portrayed the mounted police as incompetent. These last-minute changes left actors confused about their motivations, resulting in performances one critic described as Mounties who seem unsure whether they're supposed to be heroes or buffoons. The original composer quit halfway through scoring, which explains why the music shifts jarringly between orchestral themes and what sounds suspiciously like library music. One particularly embarrassing scene shows a character walking through deep snow that's clearly just painted cotton batting. The horse stunts were so poorly executed that during a chase scene, you can clearly see riders holding on for dear life rather than controlling their mounts. The climactic confrontation between Mounties and Sioux warriors used the same 20 extras switching between costumes, creating unintentional comedy when eagle-eyed viewers spotted the same distinctive faces on both sides of the conflict. Critics panned the wooden dialogue, with one noting, "The actors deliver lines as if they're reading a Mountie training manual for the first time." Another wrote, "This film gives maple syrup a bad name." The film's attempt at depicting cultural tensions between Americans and Canadians fell flat, with scenes so dull that test audiences reportedly asked if they were watching the actual training films for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. It quickly disappeared from theaters and is now considered the film that temporarily killed Hollywood's interest in Northern frontier stories. 5. A Four for Texas, 1963. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin should have guaranteed box office gold, but this Western comedy about rival gamblers teaming up to open a casino landed with a thud. Director Robert Aldrich intensely disliked Sinatra's unprofessional attitude and unsuccessfully tried to have him removed from the film. The feud created tension so thick that crew members reported Sinatra and Aldrich wouldn't even speak directly to each other on set, instead relaying messages through assistants. The film originally included Hollywood's first nude screen test with Anita Ekberg and Ursula Andress, but the Hays board demanded all bare skin be cut, leaving awkward editing jumps throughout the final version. Sinatra reportedly showed up late, left early, and sometimes skipped shooting entirely, forcing expensive schedule changes. One crew member claimed Sinatra never worked more than 4 hours on any day, leaving Martin to carry scenes alone with stand-ins. The script was cobbled together from two different screenplays, explaining why the film feels like it has multiple personality disorder. The first half focuses on a rivalry, while the second suddenly transforms into a heist movie. Aldrich tried to quit 3 times during production, but was contractually trapped. After one particularly frustrating day, he allegedly told his assistant director, "My career is being buried in the Texas sand with every frame we shoot." Martin seemed to be in on the joke, ad-libbing lines not in the script like, "Are we still making this thing?" that somehow made it into the final cut. He reportedly showed up drunk for several scenes, creating continuity problems when his level of intoxication visibly changed between shots. The climactic riverboat sequence was so poorly staged that water levels in background shots changed dramatically from one angle to another. Critics demolished the film, with one famously writing, "With friends like these, the Western genre needs no enemies." And the New York Times called it a Western with all the authenticity of a Times Square souvenir shop. Variety noted, Sinatra and Martin appear to be having a private joke at the audience's expense. The film's tagline boasted, "The Far West has never been so far out," but audiences found it so far from entertaining that it failed to recoup its bloated budget, becoming a legendary example of how star power alone can't save a directionless Western. 6. The Quick Gun, 1964. Audie Murphy deserved better than this bargain basement western about a gunslinger returning to claim his father's ranch while his old gang plans to rob the town bank. The budget was so laughably small that during shootouts you can clearly see actors flinching before the blanks are fired. Director Sidney Saul Cow reportedly apologized to Murphy after watching the first cut, saying, "We've made a real stinker here." Murphy was paid $37,500 for his performance, which even in 1964 was considered lowball for the decorated war hero turned actor. The production couldn't afford proper stunt doubles, resulting in a painfully awkward scene where Murphy clearly falls off his horse accidentally rather than as scripted. The musical score shamelessly recycled variations of Do Not Forsake Oh My Darling so many times that preview audiences started humming along mockingly. The set was so cheaply constructed that during a saloon fight, a whole wall visibly moves when an actor is pushed against it. The town itself consisted of just 4 buildings shot from different angles to create the illusion of a complete settlement. One crew member later revealed that the production was so budget constrained that they could only afford to feed the horses every other day, explaining why the animals look increasingly malnourished as the film progresses. The script underwent daily rewrites to accommodate budget cuts, creating a narrative so confusing that Murphy himself reportedly asked, "Who am I supposed to be mad at today?" The climactic bank robbery scene is so poorly staged that money bags clearly labeled property of RKO Studios can be spotted in several shots. The film recycled costumes from 3 previous westerns, which explains why some outfits look noticeably worn and dated compared to others. Critics were merciless, with Variety calling it a western so predictable that audiences can recite the dialogue before the actors. Another wrote, "The quick gun is aptly named as viewers will wish for a quick end to their misery." The film became notorious for its climactic gunfight, where bullets hit walls without leaving marks, prompting one reviewer to joke, "The quick gun features the least damaging bullets in Western history." James Best, who played Sheriff Scotty, later gained fame as Sheriff Roscoe P. Coltrane in The Dukes of Hazzard, proving some careers can survive even the worst Westerns. 7. Guns of the Timberland, 1960, Alan Ladd's fading star power couldn't elevate this tepid tale of loggers versus ranchers. The film feels like it was assembled from Western cliches pulled from a hat, with Ladd sleepwalking through his role. The studio slashed the budget midway through filming, resulting in continuity errors so glaring that trees appear and disappear between shots in the same scene. Director Robert Webb reportedly drank heavily during production, with crew members claiming he would nap between takes, while assistant directors actually ran the set. The film's love interest was recast 3 times, resulting in awkward editing where Ladd's romantic interest changes height and hair color subtly throughout the film. Jean Cran, who played the female lead, later described it as the most disorganized set I've ever worked on. The conflict between loggers and ranchers promised environmental themes ahead of their time but delivered dialogue so stilted that test audiences laughed during dramatic confrontations. One infamous scene features Ladd giving an impassioned speech about timber conservation while standing in front of obviously fake trees. The logging sequences were so unconvincing that actual lumberjacks who attended screenings complained about the inaccurate techniques shown. Ladd's drinking problems were evident throughout filming, with many scenes requiring multiple takes because he couldn't remember simple lines. His deteriorating health is visible on screen, with his appearance noticeably changing from scene to scene. The stunt coordination was so poor that during a fight sequence, a stuntman can be seen waiting patiently for his cue to fall down after being punched. Critics panned it mercilessly, with one writing, "The only thing being cut in Guns of the Timberland is corners on the production budget." The New York Times called it a film that makes watching trees grow seem like high adventure by comparison. The Hollywood Reporter noted, "Ladd seems to be conserving energy throughout, perhaps for a better film that never came." The movie bombed so thoroughly that it became known as the final nail in the coffin of Ladd's career, marking a sad end to what had once been an A-list Western star. Even devoted Ladd fans consider this his creative low point. 8. Jesse James meets Frankenstein's daughter, 1966. This bizarre mashup attempted to combine westerns with horror and achieved the rare feat of failing spectacularly at both. John Lupton plays the legendary outlaw who takes shelter with Maria Frankenstein, who promptly turns his wounded companion into a zombie. Billed as the terror shock show of the West, it delivered neither terror nor shocks, just unintentional comedy. The film was shot in just 8 days on a budget so small that crew members joked, the catering cost more than the special effects. The lab equipment came from Ken Strickfaden, who used the same gadgets in Universal's classic Frankenstein films. This was one of the few times these props were filmed in color, which proved to be the film's only historical significance. The screenplay contains glaring historical inaccuracies, including the fact that Frankenstein never had a daughter in Mary Shelley's original novel. The script mixes timelines so carelessly that Jesse James appears to be operating decades after his actual death. One particularly ridiculous scene features Frankenstein's daughter explaining advanced scientific concepts to baffled cowboys using terminology that wouldn't exist for another century. The makeup for the monster was so cheaply done that the actor's fake scars visibly peel off during intense scenes. The transformation sequence recycles footage footage from an entirely different film, creating jarring shifts in film quality and lighting. The Western elements fare no better, with gunfights so poorly choreographed that actors clearly miss by several feet while their targets fall anyway. Critics eviscerated it, with one writing, "This film answers the question nobody asked. What if Jesse James and Frankenstein were equally boring?" Another called it the cinematic equivalent of mixing chocolate with pickles. Produced as part of a double feature with Billy the Kid vs. Dracula, also directed by William Bodine, the pairing became known as the double feature that killed the Western horror hybrid before it began. The director himself reportedly introduced screenings by saying, "You folks are about to see the worst picture I ever made." Modern cult audiences enjoy it ironically as a so bad it's good experience, but in 1966 it was simply considered an embarrassment to both genres it attempted to blend. 9. The Savage Guns, 1962. This early attempt at a spaghetti western before Leone defined the subgenre feels like a pale imitation of what the style would eventually become. The Spanish-American co-production about a drifter helping a rancher against bandits tried to capitalize on the emerging European western market, but lacked both authenticity and imagination. Director Michael Carreras later admitted, "We were trying to make an American western with European money and ended up pleasing neither audience." The production was so troubled that lead actor Richard Basehart threatened to quit multiple times, staying only because his contract would have bankrupted him with penalties. The film's gunfights were filmed with prop guns that frequently misfired, leading to strange editing cuts where characters suddenly have their weapons drawn without drawing them. One stuntman broke his leg in a fall, and the production simply wrote his character out rather than wait for recovery. Language barriers created constant confusion on set. The Spanish crew often misunderstood English directions, resulting in sets built to the wrong specifications. In one scene, a doorway was constructed too short, forcing Basehart to awkwardly duck every time he entered a room. The Spanish extras hired to play Mexican bandits couldn't understand their English dialogue, creating wooden performances where they phonetically recited lines without comprehending their meaning. The film's attempts at dramatic tension fall completely flat. One particularly infamous scene involves a standoff so poorly paced that audiences at test screenings asked if the projector had broken. The cinematography tried to copy American westerns but was hampered by inferior equipment, creating shots that are either overexposed or so dark that action is barely visible. The dubbing for Spanish actors is so poorly synchronized that dialogue continues after characters have closed their mouths. Critics dismissed it as a western without a soul, with Variety noting it had all the excitement of watching tumbleweeds roll through an empty town. The New York Times called it a film that makes viewers long for the authenticity of singing cowboys. The film's tagline promised savage guns and savage hungers exploding, but audiences found nothing explosive about its plotting pace and derivative plot. It became the cautionary example studios pointed to when warning about international co-productions, with one executive reportedly saying, "It's not American enough for cowboys and not European enough for art houses." 10. Tickle Me, 1965. Elvis Presley plays a singing cowboy working at a dude ranch for rich women in this musical western that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The king took a substantial pay cut to $750,000, still enormous for 1965, in exchange for 50% of profits, but the film was such a calculated cash grab that Presley didn't even record new songs for it. All tracks were recycled from earlier albums, marking the only Elvis film without a fresh soundtrack. The production was a rescue mission for financially troubled Allied artists, with Presley essentially saving the studio from bankruptcy. The script went through 7 writers, none of whom could craft a coherent story, resulting in bizarre tonal shifts from comedy to western to musical within single scenes. Director Norman Taurog reportedly told crew members, "Just keep Elvis in frame and nobody will notice the story makes no sense." The plot veers wildly between genres, starting as a ranch comedy, shifting to a haunted house mystery, then morphing into a treasure hunt, before concluding as a romantic musical. This schizophrenic approach left audiences bewildered about what they were watching. Elvis himself seemed confused on screen, with his performance varying dramatically from scene to scene as if he were acting in entirely different movies that were accidentally spliced together. The supporting cast was clearly hired for budget reasons rather than talent, with wooden performances that make Elvis look like Laurence Olivier by comparison. The romantic subplot is particularly painful, featuring chemistry so non-existent that test audiences actually laughed during what was supposed to be a passionate kiss. The Western elements are so half-hearted that during a supposed horse-riding sequence, Elvis is clearly on a stationary prop with projection screens creating the illusion of movement. Critics were harsh, with one famously writing, "Elvis may be the king of rock and roll, but in Tickle Me, he's barely the court jester of westerns." The Los Angeles Times called it a film in desperate search of a reason to exist. Variety noted, "The only thing being tickled here is Allied Artists' bank account." Despite the critical drubbing, Elvis fans turned out in sufficient numbers to make it profitable, though Presley later ranked it among his least favorite film experiences. Today, it's viewed as prime evidence of how Presley's managers cared more about merchandising than meaningful artistic choices. 11. A Time for Killing, 1967. This Civil War Western starring Glenn Ford features Harrison Ford in his first credited film role, though he probably wishes it wasn't. The convoluted story of escaped Confederate prisoners pursued by Union troops who don't know the war has ended received such negative test screenings that Columbia Pictures shelved it for months before reluctantly releasing it to empty theaters. The production was cursed from the start with two directors. Phil Carlson was fired halfway through, and Roger Corman stepped in to salvage what he could. The script was rewritten daily, confusing actors who sometimes played scenes without knowing their characters' motivations. Weather problems forced location changes, resulting in strange continuity errors, where landscapes changed drastically between scenes. The film's troubled production history is evident in every frame. Scenes shot by different directors have noticeably different visual styles, creating a disjointed viewing experience. Several characters have unexplained costume changes between sequences, reflecting the chaotic shooting schedule that often jumped around the script. The battle scenes are particularly unconvincing, with the same 24 extras recycled to create the illusion of larger armies, often resulting in the same distinctive faces appearing on both sides of the conflict. Harrison Ford's brief appearance is so forgettable that he later claimed he couldn't remember filming it when interviewers asked about his first role. Glenn Ford appears visibly bored throughout, often delivering lines with all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. The musical score shifts jarringly between Civil War-era themes and inappropriately modern compositions, reflecting the multiple composers who worked on the troubled production. One peculiar on-set incident occurred when President Johnson's daughter visited her boyfriend George Hamilton, bringing Secret Service agents who surrounded the set with weapons drawn. Glenn Ford's son, who played a soldier, later admitted he had to be careful not to point his prop rifle toward the president's daughter. Critics dismantled the film, with one writing, "A Time for Killing is also a time for napping." Another noted, "The Civil War ended more decisively than this meandering plot." The film's editing was so choppy that several characters disappear without explanation, leading one reviewer to speculate they likely walked off in search of a better movie. 12. Young Billy Young, 1969. Robert Mitchum stars in this snooze-inducing tale of a peace-loving man becoming a deputy marshal to avenge his son's death. Despite a promising premise, the execution was so lifeless that it was completely overshadowed by Western classics. True Grit and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, released the same year. Mitchum was so disillusioned by the experience that he announced plans to retire from acting after filming Wrapped. The production suffered from bizarre pacing decisions. Despite being top billed, Mitchum doesn't appear until 17 minutes into the film, and leading lady Angie Dickinson is absent until the 43-minute mark. Director Burt Kennedy later admitted, "We had a script problem from day one, but the studio wouldn't delay the start date." The film went through 3 cinematographers, resulting in noticeably different lighting styles between scenes. The plot holes are so numerous that audiences at test screenings openly laughed during dramatic moments. In one particularly egregious example, a character who is shot and presumably killed mysteriously reappears in the background of a later scene with no explanation. The timeline is so carelessly constructed that day turns to night and back again within what's supposed to be a single continuous sequence. Mitchum's disinterest is painfully evident on screen. He reportedly showed up to set having memorized none of his lines, instead reading them off cue cards held just off camera. This explains his oddly disconnected performance and frequent unusual pauses mid-sentence. Angie Dickinson seems equally disengaged, later admitting she took the role only because she needed to pay for home renovations. Critics were unmerciful, with Variety calling it a Western that moves slower than a 3-legged horse. The New York Times wrote, "Young Billy Young makes the Old West seem not wild but merely tedious." One particularly savage review noted, "The only thing young about this film is its immaturity." Mitchum earned $200,000 for his performance, but reportedly told friends it wasn't worth the boredom. Thankfully, Mitchum reconsidered retirement and appeared in Ryan's Daughter the following year, but this Western remains a low point that nearly ended the career of one of Hollywood's most iconic actors. I hope you enjoyed this video on the worst Westerns of the 1960s. Let me know in the comments which of these flops you've actually seen, or if there's another Western did you think deserved to make this list. Was the 1960s actually the beginning of the end for classic Westerns, or just a decade with some spectacular failures among the classics? Some film historians argue that these very failures pushed filmmakers like Leone and Peckinpah to reinvent the genre with more gritty realism. What do you think? Hit the notification button to get my new videos and check out my channel for more Western content.